In Quentin Tarantino's gorge-blooded western whodunit, The Hateful Eight, there are no heroes, just a room full of violent strangers. But who's telling the truth and who's lying? In this video I'll break down the film's story, its theme, and will also explain its violent conclusion. Fair warning, this analysis will contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen the film, I suggest you watch it first before viewing this video. Twenty 2015's The Hateful Eight came on the heels of Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained. In both those films, victims of the time were allowed a revisionist revenge and closure on the periods depicted. But in his eighth release, Tarantino would painfully remind audiences of the divided present. We'll examine how Tarantino's Western is an allegory for our current times. But first, let's take a quick look at The Hateful Eight's cinematic influences. In almost every review of The Hateful Eight, the comparison to John Carpenter's The Thing is unavoidable. A group of people are trapped in a desolate-filled wasteland, then claustrophobia slides into paranoia, and paranoia consumes the atmosphere for the remainder of both films. We also have an evil that's hiding in plain sight.
One of them fellas is not what he says he is.
Somebody in this camp ain't what he appears to be. Right now, that may be one or two of us. By spring, it could be all of us.
Finally, there's star Kurt Russell, playing a major lead in both films. But almost no American reviews brought up its comparison to the pessimistic 1968 Western, The Great Silence, directed by Italian filmmaker Sergio Corbucci, a major influence on Tarantino. Italian westerns or spaghetti westerns were a new movement in the 1960s. Most theatrical westerns had faded out around the same time, and cowboy stories migrated towards television. But in 1964, beginning with Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, Italian westerns quickly became popular. Unlike Sergio Leone, the other Sergio's films were less about opera and more about depravity. If the westerns of John Ford were about triumph and justice, then Corbucci's westerns were about the unjust and failed societies. Look hard enough and you'll see Corbucci's influence on Tarantino's work.
Shot him down like a dog in the street.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
And quick Easter egg, the saloon Dr. King Schultz and Django collect their first bounty in is named Minnesota Clays. Minnesota Clay is also the name of a 1964 Corbucci western about a wrongfully convicted man who seeks vengeance after a justice system fails him.
The hell you say?
The hell you say?
But The Hateful Eight in particular uses similar motifs to Corbucci's The Great Silence. There's the bleak snow-filled setting and an even bleaker view of a nation built on violence. There's also a group of bounty hunters brought together by fate who share a stagecoach at both films' beginnings. Then there's composer Ennio Morricone, whose musical scores complement first The Great Silence, then The Hateful Eight. Both films also feature a strong woman of color. In The Hateful Eight, it's Minnie, the owner of Minnie's Haberdashery. In The Great Silence, it's Vanetta McGee, who hires a bounty hunter played by John Louis Trenton Young to avenge the death of her husband against a ruthless killer played by Klaus Kinski, who hides behind the law while inflicting sadistic violence. Both films could be political allegories of the era they're produced. In this interview, Tarantino explains how most westerns are allegorical of the period they're made.
The Western has always been a really interesting genre, and I think there's no other genre that reflects the decade in which it was made more than the Westerns made during particular decades. And
Like the Searchers.
Yeah, the Searchers. Well, a good example is the 50s, because probably the time when the Westerns were the most popular. They reflected an Eisenhower ideal of America. They reflected a perceived American exceptionalism. All right, having won the World War II, and even the prosperity of America at that time. They took Western heroes and built them up as demigods. You know, whether it be even outlaws like Bully the Kid or Jesse James and the stories that were told at that period of time. And then obviously in characters like Buffalo Bill or Wyatt Earp. But then if you look at the Westerns of the 70s and the very, very late 60s, that was a very cynical time in America, and America had lost trust in itself and had lost trust in its heroes. And actually, the cynicism of movies back then actually confirmed Americans' right to feel cynical about their time period. And the Westerns reflected that.
The Great Silence is an incredibly bleak film. I won't entirely spoil the ending, but I will say it's a comment on the political era it was produced, referencing both the assassinations of Che Guevara and Malcolm X. There's the oppressor, there's the oppressed, and then there's what happens when the two meet. If you want to learn more about The Great Silence, there's many articles and commentaries from director Alex Cox, which I'll link in the description. We've seen how Corbucci used the Western as a political allegory, so now let's see how Tarantino does the same with The Hateful Eight. Unlike most Oscar baity films Hollywood produces on racism, The Hateful Eight wisely chooses not to bash its audience over the head with political correctness. Instead, we the audience are stuck with these 8 despicable characters. You either find something redeemable about them, or you don't. You're now an active participant in this story, and whatever feelings you have towards a character you most identify is either proved right or wrong by the film's end. So let's start from the beginning. The Hateful Eight is a story about fate. By fate, these strangers cross paths. By fate, they're being chased by a deadly blizzard. By fate, some heard of or even know each other, and also by fate, they're all stuck in this one location. It's manifest destiny that brought them here. In one of the opening shots, there's even a large cross looking down over the stagecoach, setting the theme of manifest destiny. A bounty hunter named John Ruth, played by Kurt Russell, escorts a wanted criminal, Daisy Domergue, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh. The stagecoach stops for another bounty hunter named Major Marquez Warren, played by Samuel L. Jackson. Major Warren negotiates his way onto the stagecoach, but only after he disarms for John Ruth. Notice how Major Warren's uniform consists of white gloves, a metaphor for his character, who writes and talks in the language of someone trying to survive in a white man's world. Then we have Chris Mannix, played by Walton Goggins. Mannix claims to be the new sheriff of Red Rock, the town Daisy is to be hung. But unlike Major Warren,
Nope.
and that his status alone should be enough to board John Ruth's stagecoach. It first appears Mannix has more in common with Daisy than with Warren and John Ruth. The conversation quickly becomes political as Mannix, a southern rebel, feuds with northerner Major Warren. The two men are set up as adversaries for the remainder of the film. The other threat besides the hateful strangers is the blizzard outside. In John Carpenter's The Thing, the monster comes from outer space in the form of a shape-shifting alien. But in The Hateful Eight, the monster is a snowy blizzard that's used as a metaphor for hate itself. Then there's the horses, one white, the other black, moving through what they've both been conditioned to tolerate. So why would Tarantino decide to shoot his movie in a wide aspect ratio of 70mm, only to have it remain in a confined space with a few actors? Well, there's a few reasons. First, Tarantino used confined spaces with wide-angle shots the same way Stanley Kubrick did with The Shining. In The Shining, Kubrick had several sequences where he uses wide-angle shots in smaller spaces. This not only gives off a feeling of claustrophobia, but it also desensitizes the audience as the environment swallows up its inhabitants. Second, this is an actor's movie. Director John Cassavetes once said, "The greatest location in the world is the human face." The Hateful Eight is a film that relies mostly on its performances. In 70mm, you'll spot more details that the wide aspect ratio allows you to notice. Upon second and third viewings, you'll notice details like Daisy laughing at Oswaldo's proper English accent, because later in the film, it's revealed that he actually speaks with a working class Cockney accent.
So I got a federal bounty of $15,000 on my head.
Details within the frame are an important part of this story. When Major Warren spots certain details in minis, he knows something bad has happened, yet he still keeps his poker face in this group of strangers. As the film progresses, we the audience aren't given much to go on as to who's lying and who's being truthful. After being prodded by Chris Mannix, Major Warren confesses the Lincoln letter is a lie. This upsets John Ruth, who says,
Well, I guess it's true what they say about you people. Can't trust a fucking word comes out of your mouth.
Warren admits the letter is a lie, but he also admits it's that very lie that's kept him alive.
The only time black folks is safe is when white folks is disarmed. And this letter had the desired effect of disarming white folks.
It's no coincidence why Tarantino uses Abraham Lincoln in his film, because it was President Lincoln who emancipated 3 million slaves in his proclamation, "Shall be then, henceforward, and forever free." In the following scene, Ward again uses language to his advantage. He spots General Smithers, whom he remembers from the Battle of Baton Rouge, for letting young black soldiers die in the cold after being captured. Major Warren has a reason to kill the general, but if he draws on an unarmed man, he's told,
"If you shoot this unarmed old man, I guarantee I will hang you by the neck until you are dead."
So Warren uses words like a weapon to engage the general in a shooting. Let's take a quick look at Tarantino's first produced screenplay, True Romance. In True Romance, Cliff Worley, played by the iconic Dennis Hopper, also uses words like a weapon. Cliff knows Sicilian mobster Vincenzo Cacotti, played by Christopher Walken, is most likely going to torture him until he gives up his son Clarence's location. So Cliff tells Cacotti a story that involves insulting his Sicilian lineage.
Your part, eggplant.
His words are used like a weapon to trigger the mobster into killing him quicker.
I haven't killed anybody since 1984.
That scene is similar to this scene in that Warren manipulates the general into going for his pistol. Warren is the ultimate strategist. Notice the black and white chessboard that's placed in the frame for good measure. Warren plays on the general's emotions as he tells the story of his son's depraved punishment. As the Major speaks, we're showing him putting words into his victim's mouth. Whether you believe this scene actually happened or not is up for debate. But if I personally had to guess, I'd say it's either a lie or greatly exaggerated. Either way, the story has the desired effect as the general goes for his gun. Now let's talk about Daisy. At the beginning of the film, she's set up as the criminal. Yet you may even feel sympathetic towards her after she's handled violently by John Ruth. Why would this big strong man be so cruel to this unthreatening looking woman? But as the story progresses, you begin to see why John Ruth takes such drastic precautions. Daisy is a cold-blooded murderer. She's smart, maniacal, ruthless, and cunning. She has a high bounty of $10,000 for a reason. Domergue or Demingre plays a big role in the film's theme. Throughout the film, she is referred to by all the characters, including the narrator, as Domergue. But by the film's end, she refers to herself as
the Jody Domingre Gang.
Same name, different meaning, depending on who you ask. The same metaphor crosses in the Major Warren and Chris Mannix arc. These two men couldn't be more different, yet they're similar. One's a northerner, the other a southerner. One's black, the other white. Both are racist. Mannix, a Confederate rebel, both speaks and practices racism. Major Warren is also guilty of both, when Mannix reminds him of his role in the extermination of the American Indian. But by the film's end, these men have more in common than they both think. Notice how similar their clothes look once their armor is removed and the truth is revealed. They're both men of the law, but in a world full of hateful people, they've both been conditioned into thinking they're supposed to be enemies. The theme of manifest destiny comes back into play in the climax of the film. It's at this point we know Daisy and her gang are awful people. They've hardly flinched while murdering a room full of innocent people, suggesting they've probably done this before. If we go back to an earlier scene, Oswaldo gives a monologue about what civilized society calls justice versus frontier justice. In an ideal society, real justice should be delivered with dispassion.
The man who pulls the lever that breaks your neck will be a dispassionate man. And that dispassion is the very essence of justice. For justice delivered without dispassion is always in danger of not being justice.
John Ruth was a dispassionate man who believed in the law. The Major attempts to shoot Daisy, but his gun is out of bullets. Instead of facing a bullet, Daisy will face a rope, as manifest destiny meant her to. In a final act of redemption, the Northerner and the Southerner both come together for a brief moment and deliver real justice to Daisy de Mingray. The Hateful Eight is Tarantino's comment on the United States of America. It's the lies of hateful people who start wars causing bloodshed, turning people who should be friends into enemies. Notice the staging of this scene. The colors are red, white, and blue. The Northerner faces south, while the Southerner faces north. They know they're both gonna die. Then Maddox reads the Lincoln letter one last time. There's an optimism in his words, but as he reads the lie, he almost sounds convinced that there might be a time when those words will become truth. Whether you believe that or not is all an act of perspective. I'm Jeremy Hamley, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.